When you're making a point to support your argument, you need to have evidence to back that point up. This video will show 5 different types of evidence, as well as talk about what 3 things you should consider when choosing the right evidence and what your next step should be. There are 5 types of evidence that we will talk about in this video, and the first is a fact or a statistic. On this slide, you will see that there is a fact that was taken from a sample essay that you may or may not have seen. Even if you haven't seen the sample essay, you can still make sense of this evidence. So the evidence says a 2014 study by the Economic Policy Institute estimated that people with 4-year college degrees earned 98% more per hour than those who did not finish college. In a fact or a statistic, you're looking for something like a study or a number, a percent, a date to prove your point. This particular point was in the essay, in the paragraph that was trying to prove the argument that college graduates earn more money. Another type of evidence is a story or an anecdote. Here is a story about Colleen Conroy, and she took a gap year and discovered her true passion was for writing, not geology. So she switched her major and had a successful academic career. This is a story or just a short. It doesn't have a whole plot, but it's just a short story that illustrates the point that you're trying to make. And in this case, this story was used to illustrate the point that a gap year can help you find the right career path by giving an example of someone who took a gap year in order to find the right career path. Another type of evidence that you might include is an example. Here is an example of an example. To become a web designer, real estate agent, or chef, you don't have to have a college degree, but having a degree won't prevent you from getting any of those jobs. On the other hand, you can't become a teacher, an accountant, a doctor, or an engineer without a degree. So in this example, the writer listed several examples of careers that didn't require college degrees in order to prove the point that having a college degree increases your job options. So, in one sense, they gave several examples where you didn't have to have a college degree, but then gave several examples where you do have to have a college degree. Listing is one way to use examples as evidence. Another type of evidence is using a quote. And the quote can come from an expert in the field or a non-expert, just someone. Um, for example, in order to prove that college allows students to try different career paths until they find one they're happy with, here is a quote by a non-expert. Now, as a junior, I am happier than ever. I am stimulated by my academic work and enthusiastic about my growth as a writer. So, this was what someone said. This person happened to be a non expert, although they probably are credible because they are an example of the college allowing students to try different career paths. And finally, the 5th type of evidence that we will talk about today is a scenario. A scenario is a hypothetical what if type of situation. And this scenario was created by the writer of the essay in order to prove that it's possible to save good money during a gap year. That's the argument that they're using for a gap year. And so they created this, they made it up, it's hypothetical. But it's a classic what if situation. So they say, suppose you got a 40-hour per week job that paid $10 per hour. Over the course of 1 year, that's a total of $19,200. If you could save half, $9,600, that could pay for a year of in-state tuition at many public 4-year colleges. So in this situation, the author of the essay did not find a fact or statistic or something from a source. They created some evidence by using a scenario. So, for today's purposes, there are 5 types of evidence that you could choose to include in your essay: a fact or statistic, a story or anecdote. By the way, the story or anecdote could be a hypothetical or made up story or anecdote, in which case it kind of blurs the lines between a story and anecdote or scenario. A third type of evidence is an example, a fourth is quote, and then the last is scenario. So there are three things that you need to consider when choosing evidence to support your argument. You want to think about and look for evidence that is relevant, sufficient, and credible. If it's relevant, that means that it supports the argument that you are trying to make. Sometimes evidence may be on the same topic, but it doesn't actually prove the point that you're trying to make about that topic. For example, suppose you're trying to convince your parents to let you stay out an hour later. So you argue that you are responsible and they can trust you to make good decisions. And here is the evidence that you're using. I walk the dog anytime you ask, so obviously I can be trusted. Well, that is evidence. However, it is not relevant evidence because doing a household chore does show that you're responsible. So it's on topic, but it's not proving the point that you're trying to make about responsibility. It's not the kind of responsibility that you need to make good choices about safety, which is the argument you're trying to make in this situation. Better evidence or more relevant evidence that supports the argument you are trying to make is that you have left me home on my own a few times and everything went fine. That proves that I am trustworthy. This is better evidence. It is more relevant because it's proof that you can be trusted in situations where you are unsupervised. Being able to stay out later seems like a logical next step. So, not only should the evidence that you choose be relevant, there should be enough of it. And that's what we call having sufficient evidence. Sufficient means that there's enough evidence to support the argument. You might provide some fact or story that proves your point, but if it's only a small sample, then it won't be very convincing. So, let's say, for example, you're trying to convince your principal to make the school start time later. So, you argue that students will perform better academically if they wake up later. Here is an example of evidence that is not enough. You say, I can personally focus much better in my later classes. While you are trying to argue that a late start is better and you do provide some evidence, it's actually not enough evidence because you are only one person and one person can't represent a whole group of people. So, this might be true for all students. Excuse the typo there, please. But one example isn't enough. It's a too small of a sample size. Better, more sufficient evidence would say a Northwestern University study of over 2,000 students showed that student test scores rose by 10% in schools that moved to a later start time. That is much more sufficient because it's a larger sample size, and so it's easier to draw a conclusion from that larger sample size. So, evidence should be relevant, it should be sufficient, and also it should be credible. Credible means that it comes from a reliable and unbiased source. So let's suppose that you're trying to convince a parent to only buy locally grown food. And so your argument is that locally grown food is healthier. You use this as your evidence. The local association of farmers reports that locally grown vegetables have a higher vitamin content than those shipped to stores from across the country. While that might be true that the local association of farmers said that, they actually are the ones who would be benefiting from this argument. And so they are biased. They would be receiving profit if you believed their argument. So, a better, more credible piece of evidence would be something like the USDA has reported that locally grown vegetables have a higher vitamin content than those shipped to stores from across the country. And while these two pieces of evidence are saying the same thing, it doesn't come from a local source. And so they're not going to benefit, which makes them more credible, more believable. So far, we've talked about five different kinds of evidence. We've talked about the three criteria that you should consider in choosing your evidence. And now we're going to talk about what next. Now that you've learned about these five pieces of evidence, and we've talked about relevance and sufficiency and credibility, you need to go back to your essay graphic organizer and begin filling out the evidence that you will use to support each of your 3 points. Once you have the evidence chosen, you also need to ask the question: is the evidence relevant, sufficient, and credible? If it is, great work. You're well on your way to providing a strong argument. If it's not, or if it doesn't meet one of those criteria, then you need to look for other evidence or perhaps change that point that you're trying to argue into something else that can be proven with the evidence that you have or with better evidence. So, in summary, we've talked about five types of evidence. We've talked about the 3 criteria that you should consider when choosing the right kind of evidence. And we've talked about next steps.